Tonight, the wind feels a little different. Not loud, not cold, just drifting softly outside the window, like a quiet reminder that the world keeps moving, even when everything else has slowed down. It's the kind of night that feels made for letting your shoulders drop, for letting your thoughts stretch out a little, and for listening to a long, gentle story. Before we begin, what's the weather like where you are tonight? Here, it's just this calm, wandering wind, the kind that shows up without urgency and settles into the room like an old friend. If you joined me in the last episode, when we wandered through the lost civilizations of the blockchain, you might remember how quietly a digital empire can rise and how silently it can fade. A network can feel alive one year, ancient the next, and forgotten the year after. That softness of disappearance, that slow sinking into silence, is something I keep thinking about. Tonight's story also carries that rhythm, not of collapse, but of the long arc between hope and hardship. A story of brightness, of storms, and of the quiet moments after the tide goes out. Because tonight, we're drifting toward a different kind of coastline, a place where engineers once spoke about speed the way poets talk about sunlight, a civilization that rose fast, so fast it startled even the people who built it, and then stumbled, fell quiet, and learned to breathe again. Tonight, we're telling the story of Solana's sunrise, not the hype, not the charts, not the headlines, but the civilization underneath. The early dawn, the growing pains, the storms, and the long, soft rebuilding that followed. But before we get there, I want you to imagine something with me. Picture a quiet coastline at dusk, soft waves rolling in with slow, steady breaths, a harbor of small boats rocking gently, their lanterns flickering in warm golds and soft blues, the kind of evening where the sky still remembers the sun but is already giving itself to the night. Now imagine a city rising on that shore, not built from stone, but from code, and the unreasonably big dreams of engineers who believed blockchains didn't have to be slow, didn't have to be heavy, didn't have to crawl through time. They believed a blockchain could move like light, and that belief, quiet, almost fragile at first, would become the heartbeat of Solana's early years. But stories don't move in straight lines. Civilizations don't either. Solana's dawn was bright, but its adolescence was messy. Its storms were loud, and its nights were darker than most people remember. Still, there's something beautiful about a civilization that refuses to stay fallen. Something human, something warm, something steady. And that's the version we're exploring tonight. A long, gentle arc through hope, pressure, failure, and quiet rebirth. So take a breath. Let your shoulders soften a little more. Settle into whatever you're resting on. And whenever you're ready, we'll begin the story of Solana's sunrise, a story of engineers, of ambition, of early brilliance, and of how a civilization learns to walk before it learns to run.
There's a particular kind of quiet that only exists in the earliest hours of morning. That faint, bluish hush before sunrise, when the world is still holding its breath, and even the air seems unsure whether it wants to move. That quiet was the atmosphere in which Solana was born. Not in sunlight, not in applause, not in a moment of public triumph, but in the kind of stillness where ideas drift gently into the mind, like ships appearing through fog. Anatoly Yakovenko had lived most of his life surrounded by clocks. Human clocks, digital clocks, network clocks. Millions of them ticking, drifting, correcting, failing, sinking. To most people, time is invisible. To Anatoly, it was a landscape, a terrain that shaped everything he built. And one night, as he was thinking about the impossibility of coordinating thousands of machines across the world, a question surfaced, softly, quietly, like a candle appearing in a dark tunnel. What if time didn't have to be agreed upon? What if time could simply be? Most blockchain designs at the time treated time like a negotiation, a committee meeting held every few seconds, with nodes raising their hands, voting on which moment the universe currently occupied. Beautiful, philosophical, but slow. Anatoly wondered what would happen if a blockchain didn't have to ask permission from the world to move forward. What if the chain could follow a single, unbroken thread of time, woven by a predictable mathematical rhythm, so steady that nodes could align with it the way migratory birds align with the Earth's magnetic field? It was not a normal engineering idea. It was almost a spiritual one. And that may be why it resonated so deeply with the quiet, thoughtful people who would soon become the first Solana engineers. Many revolutions begin with noise. Solana's began with silence. The earliest conversations took place in dim rooms lit by laptop screens and in long, meandering voice calls, where half the participants were pacing around their apartments, while the other half scribbled diagrams onto whatever paper they could find. These engineers were not trying to create fame. They were trying to solve a question that had been bothering them for years. Could blockchains move at the natural speed of computation instead of the artificial speed of agreement? They weren't rebels. They weren't trying to overthrow anything. They weren't even sure the idea would work, but the curiosity was irresistible. And so they began building. The first prototypes were awkward, shy creatures, barely walking, stumbling often, the way all newborn systems do. But the engineers treated them with a gentle patience, as though the prototypes were toddlers learning to balance. They gave these early test networks names that felt like inside jokes. They wrote logs that read like cryptic diaries of a ship crew lost at sea. They watched timestamps drift as if time itself were struggling to understand its new role. Sometimes the chain would run beautifully for hours before collapsing into a pile of unexpected behaviors. Sometimes it would fail in ways no one had ever seen before. Loops, stalls, frozen blocks, messages arriving like tangled ribbons. But every failure carried a strange beauty. Every crash revealed a new truth. Real engineering is not a war against chaos. It is a conversation with it. Why did you behave this way? Where did this divergence begin? What are you trying to tell us? The team spent countless nights following these questions the way astronomers follow the paths of distant stars. And slowly, so slowly that no one noticed at first, a shape began to form, a feeling, a rhythm. Proof of history wasn't just working, it was singing. A chain with time woven into its fabric didn't have to wait for the world to agree on the present moment. It simply moved forward, like a river following gravity. Blocks weren't steps, they were waves. And this changed everything. Speed was no longer forced, it was natural. Consensus was no longer a committee meeting. It was a gentle alignment with a clock that never hesitated. The engineers felt it, that small thrill of building something that behaves more like a living thing than a mechanical one. When the first public test networks opened, the community was tiny. Just a handful of curious explorers, lonely validators humming in bedrooms, developers who liked breaking things just to see what would happen. Some joined because they wanted raw speed. Some because they loved complex systems. Some because they sensed a spark here that was absent elsewhere. But whatever their reasons, they brought energy, questions, experiments, laughs, failures, hope. Solana's dawn was not marked by a single event. It was marked by a sound. The sound of a young city waking up, not with crowds, but with footsteps. Single footsteps at first, then groups, slowly gathering. If you could have walked through that early Solana city, you would have seen strange, beautiful things. Projects held together by fragile prototypes. Developers arguing endlessly about runtime behavior. Validators celebrating their first stable epoch. People explaining proof of history to their pets. Early block explorers lighting up like constellations. It was messy. It was chaotic. It was alive. And through this slow building life, one truth became clear. Solana wasn't built to imitate. It wasn't built to compete. It wasn't built to follow. It was built to imagine. It didn't want to be the next Ethereum or the next Bitcoin. It wanted to be the first chain that didn't rely on waiting. A chain that flowed. A chain that felt like sunlight moving through a room. But even sunlight can overwhelm a young civilization. Even beauty can create pressure. By late 2020, Solana had grown faster than anyone expected. The ecosystem expanded like a harbor suddenly filled with new ships, each with its own cargo, its own noise, its own dreams. And the engineers, those quiet stewards of the dawn, felt a shift. The city they built was no longer waking up. It was surging forward. One evening, during a stress test, none of them intended to be a stress test, the logs erupted with messages. Transactions flowed into the network faster than the validators could coordinate them. The system, instead of slowing, sped up. A flash of movement that startled even the people who wrote the code. But what they felt in that moment was recognition. A threshold had been crossed.
The chain was no longer an experiment. It had become a place. A living, breathing city with residents, traffic, and expectations. A civilization in motion. Communities have temperatures. Some are cold and analytical. Some are loud and tribal. Solana's early community was warm. Warm like people discovering something together. Warm like early morning sun on a quiet balcony. Validators upgraded their machines with the pride of lighthouse keepers preparing for storms. Developers built side by side, fixing each other's bugs before writing their own documentation. People stayed up late, just to watch a block explorer refresh. There was joy in the inefficiency, joy in the debugging, joy in the simple fact that something new existed. But dawn never lasts forever. In mythology, dawn is always short. It exists to promise what is coming, not to sustain it. As Solana grew, transaction volume rose like a tide pulled by a bright, impossible moon. Bots discovered the network and began hammering it like waves in a storm. Projects minted tokens so fast that mempools overflowed. Users arrived in floods that no forecasting model had anticipated. With acceleration came heat. With heat came pressure. With pressure came the first cracks. Missed slots, validator desynchronization, gossip storms, runtime stalls. Not failures of concept, but symptoms of a civilization outgrowing its infrastructure. And yet, despite the strain, the community did not fracture. It held. It adapted. It learned. This is what adolescence looks like. It is not the end of dawn. It is what dawn becomes when morning finally arrives. And as Solana stepped into that morning, it carried with it the brilliance of its beginning and the weight of its potential. A weight that would soon test it in ways no one could have predicted. As the young city continued expanding, the engineers noticed something unusual, a phenomenon that happens only in fast-growing civilizations, whether digital or physical. People began imagining futures that the present could not yet support. They talked about millions of users as if they were already here. They spoke about global-scale adoption as if it was waiting outside the door. They described a world where Solana wasn't just fast, but a kind of digital bloodstream, carrying information across continents at the tempo of thought. This wasn't arrogance. It was momentum, the innocent kind that appears when something new captures the imagination of thousands. But momentum creates weight. Dreams create expectations. Expectations create pressure. And pressure, if not handled with care, can bend the beams of a young civilization. Solana's engineers began feeling that weight quietly, privately, in the spaces between their longer conversations. A stray comment like, "Did you see that traffic spike today?" Or a quiet sigh after a 12-hour debugging session. A half joke about needing to rewrite a subsystem that hadn't even finished maturing yet. Nothing dramatic, nothing alarming, but subtle signs that the city built on sunlight was beginning to cast shadows. Still, the community's warmth held the entire structure together. It's a rare feeling to build something at global scale and still feel like everyone involved is just a few steps away, easily reachable, easily heard. Developers shared ideas freely, validators shared logs like neighbors sharing tools, and users treated downtime not as disasters, but as puzzles to discuss. Almost no one spoke with hostility. They spoke with curiosity, a gentle kind, the kind that supports a civilization rather than tearing it apart. This collaborative warmth allowed the engineers to attempt more daring experiments. Some nights, they ran simulations that pushed the system into states no one expected it to survive. Other nights, they rewired aspects of the runtime while staring at screens filled with tiny waves of timing data that only they understood. There were also quieter nights, the ones the engineers rarely talk about, when they simply watched the network breathe. There is something mesmerizing
about watching a global system in motion, seeing validators scattered across the world pulse in time with a rhythm you helped create. It is not pride. Not exactly. It is more like listening to an orchestra play a piece you composed but never expected to hear performed. One engineer later described those moments as the chain whispering to us. But whispers eventually become warnings. The subtle irregularities the engineers had been noticing, the slight shifts in timing, the unpredictable traffic bursts, the validators struggling with sudden loads, began to grow louder. The chain was not failing, it was stretching. And stretch is the precursor to both breakthrough and breaking. In the months that followed, some validators found themselves working through nights just to keep pace. Developers built tools to visualize bottlenecks that barely existed a month earlier. The ecosystem grew so quickly that some days, even the block explorers felt overwhelmed. Growth isn't linear. It comes in waves, and Solana's waves were getting taller. Yet even as the system strained, the engineers never lost their calm. They didn't panic. They didn't lash out. They didn't declare emergencies. They simply adjusted. Because to them, building Solana was never about preventing failure entirely. It was about creating a system that could learn, heal, and grow stronger afterward. Many late-night debugging sessions felt more like tending a garden than fixing a machine. They pruned, watered, replanted, and let the system adapt. A surprising kind of tenderness settled into the work. Some nights, 2 or 3 engineers would sit quietly in a call, observing the live metrics together, without speaking much, like astronomers watching a sky they had spent years mapping. Every unusual spike was a comet. Every synchronization drift was a shifting constellation. Every fix was a small correction to the celestial map of the network. In those moments, Solana was not a project. It was a living system they were still learning to understand. But even the gentlest ecosystems eventually reveal their limits. One evening, during what was supposed to be a routine validator test, traffic surged unexpectedly. It wasn't a malicious attack. It wasn't even a coordinated stress test. It was simply too much activity arriving all at once, a wave hitting the harbor from multiple directions. Validators began dropping from consensus, slots began slipping. The orderly rhythm of the chain grew uneven, then hesitant. But still, no one panicked.
The engineers watched with a quiet intensity, not afraid, but attentive, like sailors recognizing a weather pattern on the horizon. They knew the chain was entering its next phase. Testnets were no longer tests. Mainnet was no longer experimental. This was the beginning of Solana's true adolescence, the years where its greatest gifts would become its greatest challenges. Speed creates heat. Heat creates stress. Stress reveals weaknesses. Weaknesses invite growth. And growth? Growth is never gentle. The engineers understood this. The community felt it. The chain itself seemed aware of it, as if its heartbeat were preparing for something heavier. The dawn era of Solana was drawing to a close,
Not because anything had gone wrong, but because everything had gone right faster than anyone predicted. Civilizations do not stay in their dawn forever. Dawn is a promise. Morning is the test. As Solana entered that morning, the brightness that once felt warm began to expose the cracks beneath the surface. Cracks that no one had noticed in the soft light of early sunrise. The city, built on sunlight, was about to learn that even the purest foundations must face storms. What the engineers had created was extraordinary. But extraordinary things attract extraordinary pressure. And the pressure was no longer distant. It had arrived. It was growing. It was shaping the next chapter of this young civilization. The world would soon see outages, congestion, arguments, innovations, heartbreak, breakthroughs, and storms that no one expected. But none of that belongs to this chapter. This chapter ends with a city standing tall at the end of its dawn, filled with light, filled with promise, filled with a kind of innocence that only exists once in the lifetime of a civilization. Later, there would be noise, there would be conflict, confusion, and nights darker than any the engineers had predicted. But for now, in this last moment of quiet morning, Solana was simply what it had always been from the beginning. A dream written in time. A river of blocks that never stopped flowing. A city built not from stone, but from imagination. And as the sunlight of early success poured into every corner of the network, the engineers finally stepped back and realized the dawn was over. The day was beginning. And nothing would ever be the same again. As Solana's mornings became busier and louder, the first true signs of strain appeared not in headlines or social media debates, but deep inside the quiet metrics that only engineers and validators paid attention to. There were moments when blocks stretched just a little longer than expected, when gossip packets drifted unpredictably, when a validator would suddenly fall behind and then catch up in a burst of activity that resembled the heartbeat of someone startled out of sleep. These were small things, subtle, almost invisible to all but the people who had been watching the network breathe since its earliest days, but they were the first hints that Solana was growing faster than its foundations had time to harden. Behind the scenes, conversations among validators grew more technical, more attentive. Someone might post a graph showing gossip traffic forming strange patterns. Another validator might mention that their node's CPU briefly surged for no obvious reason. Someone else might quietly admit they didn't like the shape of a certain latency curve. No one panicked, but everyone listened. They were like caretakers watching a gifted child grow so quickly that even its own limbs occasionally surprised it. At the time, people still spoke about these oddities with jokes and gentle metaphors. Heh, Solana is running faster than it knows how to run, someone wrote. This chain needs a nap, another quipped.
Yet inside these soft comments was a shared recognition. Something beneath the surface was beginning to shift. The broader ecosystem, however, did not see tension. To most users, Solana felt unstoppable. Transactions confirmed faster than they could blink. NFTs minted in seconds. Bots raced each other across the chain at furious speeds. Young developers shipped new projects with the energy of people who believed they were living at the frontier of a new digital civilization. And in a sense, they were. Solana became the preferred playground for builders who felt slowed down elsewhere. The chain gave them permission to experiment wildly, to think bigger, to build systems that weren't possible on slower blockchains. That excitement brought its own momentum, and with momentum came expectations nobody had formally agreed to, but everyone felt. As new users arrived, the network's rhythm shifted. What once looked like a smooth river of transactions now resembled a river in spring flood, still beautiful, still flowing, but with sudden currents, surges, and eddies. Mempools spiked unpredictably. Throughput climbed. Validator load grew more uneven. Clusters of traffic began to form at strange intervals, like crowds gathering spontaneously in a marketplace. Solana wasn't breaking, it was simply being asked to perform at a level beyond what any blockchain had ever attempted. The engineers who had carefully tended its early growth recognized the signs immediately. This wasn't failure, it was adolescence. During this period, some of the network's most fascinating behaviors emerged. Under heavy traffic, certain validators began behaving like overworked messengers, falling slightly behind before accelerating with bursts of catch-up activity. Gossip storms erupted unexpectedly, flooding nodes with packets like sudden squalls blowing through a harbor town. Entire sections of the network would hum with synchronized intensity, only to settle into a calmer rhythm minutes later. None of this was catastrophic. All of it was instructive. Solana was revealing the contours of its true complexity, the parts of its architecture that would need reinforcement before the civilization built on top of it grew too heavy. The most remarkable thing about this era was the community's reaction. Instead of criticism, there was curiosity. Instead of panic, there was patience. Builders, users, and validators genuinely liked the chain, its personality, its speed, its potential, and they treated its struggles not as failures, but as growing pains. Discord channels filled with people posting logs, offering hypotheses, sharing experiments, and giving words of encouragement. There were jokes about the chain drinking too much coffee, about validators needing yoga, about the network running before stretching. Even in stress, the tone remained warm. It was a rare moment in crypto. People cared more about helping the system mature than about complaining when it stumbled. But even the most patient civilizations eventually encounter moments that test their gentleness. One particularly memorable day, a massive wave of traffic surged into the network. It wasn't malicious, it wasn't planned, it was simply everything happening at once. A large NFT mint, several DeFi protocols hitting peak volume, arbitrage bots flooding the mempool, and thousands of regular users conducting their usual activity. All of these forces collided like converging tides, pushing the system into a state it had never experienced at this scale.
Validators' dashboards lit up, CPU usage spiked, network bandwidth stretched thin, slots slowed, blocks elongated. The heartbeat of proof of history faltered, not stopping, but stumbling, as though the chain had taken one step too quickly and momentarily lost its rhythm. Engineers across time zones paused whatever they were doing. Some stared silently at graphs that suddenly looked wrong. Others leaned in toward monitors, eyes narrowing with focus. A few opened emergency chats, not because they were afraid, but because they sensed a pivotal moment had begun. Nobody shouted, nobody panicked. The atmosphere felt more like surgeons gathering around a patient whose vital signs had just shifted. Concerned, yes, but utterly composed. Solana recovered, eventually. It always did. The network stabilized, validators resynchronized, and throughput returned to its usual pace. To most users, it was a brief hiccup, barely noticed amid the ongoing rush of activity. But to the engineers and maintainers, this moment marked the end of something, the end of the belief that Solana's early brilliance could carry it through everything. The chain was powerful, but it was still young, fast, but not infallible, ambitious, but not invulnerable. In the quiet hours after this event, small conversations began unfolding. Conversations that carried a new seriousness beneath their calm. People asked where the bottlenecks truly were, which subsystems needed reinforcement, how the chain could preserve its defining speed while gaining the durability of a mature civilization. Thoughtful, measured debates filled the developer spaces. Validators ran experiments late into the night. Architects re-examined assumptions that once felt unshakable. This was not despair. This was responsibility. A civilization realizing it must strengthen itself before continuing to grow. As traffic continued climbing, multiple smaller congestion events repeated themselves. None were fatal. Each served as a reminder that Solana was running at the very edge of what its architecture could handle. The network began to resemble a young city whose streets were suddenly crowded at all hours, whose bridges carried more weight than they were designed for, whose ports were receiving ships faster than anyone had predicted. The feeling was not that something was breaking, but that something needed reinforcement, urgently, thoughtfully, and with the level of care that matched the chain's extraordinary potential.
Builders and validators responded with the same determined warmth that defined the ecosystem. They patched, upgraded, reconfigured, optimized. They stayed up through long nights comparing logs, sharing test cases, and working through issues line by line. And yet beneath the collaboration was a soft, growing fatigue, not burnout, something gentler but heavier. The realization that brilliance alone could not carry the network forever, that ambition without the infrastructure to contain it would eventually overflow. Then came an unremarkable day, a day so quiet it would have gone unnoticed if not for the subtle emotional shift it carried. Metrics looked normal. Block times were steady. Validators exchanged their usual mix of jokes and graphs. But beneath the surface, everyone sensed the same truth. Solana had reached the limit of what a young civilization could bear without deeper structural evolution. The chain had dazzled the world, but now it needed to grow up. It needed resilience, not just speed, redundancy, not just elegance, grounding,
not just sunlight. And just as the ecosystem settled into this realization, a shadow appeared at the edge of the horizon. Not a technical shadow, but a human one. A shadow shaped by the fragility of trust, the concentration of influence, and the hidden dependencies that no one had fully acknowledged. Builders began speaking more carefully. Investors grew quieter. Some dashboards started to look strange, and in the distance a storm cloud formed, slowly, quietly, ominously. People did not yet understand what that cloud meant, not fully, but they felt its presence. A soft unease settled into the spaces between conversations. Jokes contained longer pauses. Optimism came with an asterisk. It was as though the entire civilization sensed a change in air pressure long before the storm arrived. Before the storm truly reached Solana, there was one final moment of calm, a night where the chain behaved beautifully. Validators hummed in perfect synchrony. Throughput flowed like a quiet river. The community buzzed with its familiar warmth. Ideas, debates, small discoveries, shared excitement. It was a moment that felt almost nostalgic even as it was happening, as though everyone sensed it would be the last uncomplicated evening before something vast and unexpected swept across the ecosystem. And that is how Story 2 ends, not with collapse, not with triumph, but with a fragile fullness, a network standing tall after its first true growing pains, a community wiser, more grounded, more aware of the responsibilities of building something this ambitious, a civilization at the height of its morning, unaware that its greatest test was already approaching from the distance. The sunlight that had defined Solana's identity was still warm, still bright, but on the horizon, the first dark line of the coming storm had begun to shake shape. The kind of storm that does not just challenge an architecture, but reshapes the emotional core of a community. The kind that forces a young civilization to rediscover what it truly is when the sky above it finally breaks open. And that quiet moment, standing at the edge of light, staring toward a darkening horizon, is where the next story begins.
The horizon darkened so gradually that most people didn't notice it at first. It was the kind of shift that begins not with thunder, but with a subtle stillness, a faint pause in the air, the way a coastline becomes strangely quiet before weather changes. Solana, still glowing from its vibrant adolescent morning, moved through this silence unaware. The chain hummed with its familiar rhythm. Builders continued their work. Validators tended their nodes. Users spoke with the same warm enthusiasm that had carried the ecosystem through its heaviest moments. And yet, beneath these ordinary sounds, something softer had begun to change. It began with hesitation. Small, almost imperceptible hesitations in conversations that once flowed easily. A validator mentioning an unusual dependence on a particular exchange without quite finishing the sentence. a developer, pausing before saying the name of a company that had always been spoken with casual confidence. A quiet recognition that some of Solana's brightest momentum came from tides far bigger than the chain itself, tides whose source no one fully understood. In those days, FTX felt less like a company and more like weather, something distant but reliable, a warm current that brought liquidity, attention, and stability. Few questioned its presence. Few imagined that a current that steady could ever shift. But all weather changes eventually, and this one began to change from the inside out long before the wider world noticed. For most people on Solana, life went on as usual. New projects launched with excitement. DeFi protocols absorbed fresh capital. NFT communities produced art that filled timelines with color. The chain moved with its characteristic momentum, a river of blocks, always flowing, always bright. Yet even in this brightness, faint shadows appeared in the emotional landscape of the ecosystem. Not fear, not suspicion, just a subtle discomfort, like a pressure drop before a distant storm. Some builders described sensing it without understanding why. Meetings felt heavier. Announcements from FTX began to sound different, as though the language had changed while the tone tried to stay the same. Rumors drifted through private chats, unclear and fragile, the kind that people mentioned carefully because they themselves didn't fully believe them. But rumors, like clouds, have shapes that sharpen over time. When the first irregularities emerged publicly, they did not arrive as thunder. They surfaced as questions. Small, unsettling questions about funds, balances, structures, relationships. Questions that normally would have been brushed aside, yet this time lingered. The broader crypto world reacted with its usual noise, but within the Solana ecosystem, the reaction was strangely quiet. People didn't rush to conclusions. They didn't panic. They simply listened. Listening can be its own form of fear. Validators stared at dashboards not because the chain was struggling, but because the world around it suddenly felt less stable. Developers checked dependency charts, tracing invisible lines that connected projects to liquidity sources. NFT teams stayed up late in calls, speaking in hushed tones about market conditions they couldn't quite name. Every conversation carried a new weight, as though the entire civilization had stepped into a room where someone had just delivered difficult news that no one was ready to discuss. Nothing broke. Nothing failed, but everything felt different. When the truth finally came, when the size of the collapse revealed itself, it didn't arrive like a violent storm. It arrived like a wave of cold, heavy air sweeping across a warm city. The impact was quiet at first, almost numb. People refreshed their screens, not believing what they saw. Builders who had been mid-sentence fell silent. Validators leaned back in their chairs, staring at monitors with expressions that were neither shock nor panic, but something gentler, something like grief. The chain itself kept running. That was the strange part. Solana did not falter. Slots continued. Blocks flowed. Time moved forward. And yet the emotional center of the ecosystem had shifted in a single day. Across the network, a deep stillness settled. Not despair, stillness. The kind that follows the moment when light fades unexpectedly and the mind has not yet adjusted to the change. People didn't scream into chats. They didn't blame each other. They didn't rush to declare the end. Instead, they whispered. Whispers shared numbers that didn't add up. Whispers wondered about market makers, liquidity routes, treasury exposures. Whispers from project founders who suddenly didn't know if their runway still existed. Whispers about validators who weren't sure whether they would make it through the month. And beneath all of these whispers, there was the soft, indescribable ache of realizing that a civilization powered by sunlight had lost one of its brightest artificial lights. Not the sun itself, but a lighthouse. A lighthouse that had guided the ecosystem's early expansion. A lighthouse whose beam had reached across markets, exchanges, liquidity hubs, voices. A lighthouse whose collapse left the coastline darker than anyone expected. Even those who never relied on FTX directly felt the shift. Trust is atmospheric. When it changes, everyone breathes differently. As news spread, Solana's markets trembled, gently at first, then with a deeper shiver. Prices fell, but the emotional weight was heavier than numbers. It was the sudden, quiet realization that the world beyond the chain could shake the world within it. Projects paused their launches. Builders paused their plans. The once bustling cityscape of Solana's ecosystem dimmed. Not extinguished, dimmed. Lights that once flashed brightly now glowed with a muted, introspective tone. The loud marketplaces grew still. The once relentless rush of NFT mints softened into a slow drift. Discord servers that had been filled with jokes and excitement felt like quiet libraries after closing hours. And yet, through this darkness, the chain continued its unbroken rhythm. Slot by slot, block by block, breath by breath. Almost as if Solana itself was saying, "I am still here." But the people were shaken. Some sat alone late into the night, refreshing dashboards without knowing what they hoped to see. Others stared at transaction flows, finding comfort in the chain's steady heartbeat. Teams gathered to console each other, not with solutions, but with presence. A strange tenderness took hold, an unspoken understanding that everyone was living through something historic, something heavy, something that touched the emotional core of the entire civilization. Even those who never relied on FTX directly felt the loss of innocence. Before the storm, Solana was a bright, ambitious city with limitless horizons. After the storm, it became a city standing in the dark, learning to understand itself for the first time. And this is where the real story begins. Not in the collapse, but in the quiet that followed. The quiet where people wondered, what remains when the lighthouse falls? What holds a civilization together when one of its pillars dissolves into the sea? The answers did not come immediately. They came slowly, softly, in the days when the storm clouds lingered above Solana's coastline, casting long, unfamiliar shadows over a city that had only ever known bright morning light.
The days after the collapse felt strangely weightless. Not chaotic, not loud, just emptied of their usual warmth, as if someone had opened a window during winter and let a colder kind of air drift in, like quiet exhalations. No one wanted to be the first to speak. No one wanted to say out loud what everyone already understood. And so the ecosystem held its breath. During those early hours, Solana felt like a city at dusk. Lights still shining, streets still open, but a hush settling over everything, softly, inevitably.
Builders checked their treasuries with slow, careful motions. Some stared at spreadsheets, knowing the numbers were about to change. Others simply sat beside screens, hands folded, listening to the faint hum of machines as if the hardware could offer reassurance. Validators watched the chain with an attention that bordered on devotion. Slot by slot, block by block, the rhythm continued, steady, unaffected, unmoved by the storm unfolding beyond its walls. It was almost surreal that a collapse so vast in the outside world could leave the chain's internal heartbeat so perfectly intact. But emotions don't follow technical boundaries. Even if the system remained stable, the people inside it trembled. Some felt fear, gentle, quiet fear, the kind that doesn't shout, but settles into the chest like a heavy cloud. Some felt grief, not for money, but for the image of a future that had seemed so clear only days before. And some felt a kind of disorientation, a drifting sensation that emerges when a familiar lighthouse goes dark while you are still at sea. In private calls, founders spoke softly, sometimes not about work at all, but about how strange it felt to witness something so large unravel so quickly. They used words like surreal, like unthinkable, like I still don't know how to process this. Not panic, not bitterness, just that subdued confusion that follows when the world rearranges itself without warning. For a brief moment, Solana became a quieter place. Discord channels dimmed, announcements slowed. Builders who normally shared updates every day fell silent to collect their thoughts. Projects paused launches, not because they had failed, but because the air around them no longer felt steady enough to welcome something new. Even NFT communities, normally the loudest, brightest corners of the ecosystem, lowered their voices. Artists posted soft, reflective sketches. Collectors wrote messages of solidarity. People said things like, "We'll get through this," even before fully understanding what this truly was. The storm outside continued to deepen, but inside the ecosystem, a different kind of weather formed, the quiet, collective act of bracing. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't chaotic. It was more like everyone placing a gentle hand on the walls of their homes to feel if they were still solid. And through all of this, the chain kept breathing. This mattered more than most people realized, because each time a slot advanced, each time a validator found its rhythm, each time a block finalized without hesitation, it offered a subtle message. I am still here. I can still carry you. But the people, they needed time to understand what that meant now. Some sat awake late into the night, listening to the faint whir of cooling fans, watching dashboards glow softly in dark rooms. Some went for long walks, breathing winter air that felt sharper than usual. Some reached out to friends they had never spoken to outside of group chats, seeking connection in a moment when solidity felt rare. And yet, beneath all this heaviness, a different feeling slowly emerged, fragile, faint, but present. Togetherness. It wasn't loud, it wasn't triumphant, it was simply the recognition that everyone was standing in the same wind, feeling the same cold, trying to understand the same silence. In those early storm-lit nights, the Solana community became softer, more human, more aware of itself. People wrote long posts, not to argue, but to make sense of what had happened. Validators shared operational notes to help each other survive the uncertainty of the coming weeks. Developers opened their repositories to new contributors, inviting anyone who wished to strengthen the foundation they all relied upon. A quiet determination settled in, the kind that doesn't announce itself, but grows like a lantern, slowly warming inside a dark room. No one called it resilience. No one called it rebuilding. No one gave it a name. But it was there, in the way people showed up even as the storm clouds thickened, in the way conversations shifted from disbelief to understanding to possibility, in the way the chain's steady heartbeat offered a rhythm for people whose own emotions were still unsteady. The storm had come. Its weight was undeniable. But the city had not fallen. It had simply dimmed, so it could understand what its light truly meant. And as this realization spread, quiet, fragile, shared, the next phase of the story began to take shape. Not rebuilding, not recovery, but the soft moment when people start to lift their heads, look at each other, and ask gently, what do we do now?
The days that followed were quieter still. Not empty, not lifeless, just slower. As if time itself had wrapped the ecosystem in a softer kind of fabric. People woke each morning with the same ritual. Open the charts, open the dashboards, take a breath, and remind themselves that the chain was still moving. It felt strangely grounding to see a slot increase, to watch a validator sink, to witness a system built on time continue to honor its rhythm, even as the world beyond it struggled to regain balance. Everything else felt suspended. Announcements slowed, plans paused. Community calls became small circles of quiet voices sharing thoughts rather than updates. But in the absence of momentum, something else emerged. Clarity. When noise falls away, it becomes easier to hear the quieter truths underneath. Builders began seeing their projects not as market entries, but as long-term homes they wanted to weather the seasons with. Validators recognized that their work was not merely technical. They were caretakers of a city whose foundations stretched across continents. Users realized they were not just participants, but residents in a shared story where everyone depended on the same fragile, beautiful infrastructure. This shift did not happen all at once. It happened softly, in small gestures, in long silences, in the way someone would type, "I'm still here," in a channel that had fallen quiet overnight. As the storm's financial shockwaves rippled outward, some teams found themselves without runways, without partners, without the certainty they once relied on. Yet, even in these hardest moments, there was a tenderness to how people responded.
founders reached out to other founders, offering spare resources, spare compute, even spare encouragement. NFT communities held auctions, not for profit, but to support artists whose livelihood had suddenly become uncertain. Developers volunteered their free time to help strengthen tools that the whole chain depended on. Solana, once known for speed, became known quietly, unexpectedly, for care. And gradually, almost imperceptibly, the storm began to change shape. Not gone, not past, but different. Storms are not only wind and water. Sometimes they are the long gray weeks that follow the initial impact, when the ground is soft and the future unclear, and the world feels slower than usual. During these gray weeks, the ecosystem rested. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was simply the natural way a civilization responds when it is asked to understand itself without the noise of growth. The city that had once blazed with motion now glowed with a gentler light. Lanterns in windows, status pages humming quietly, people working in smaller groups, not for glory, but for each other. There was a strange beauty in it. This softer version of Solana, stripped of the brightness of its dawn and the confidence of its morning, yet still intact, still breathing, still full of a quiet life. As markets continued to shift, and as the storm's long shadow persisted, a new kind of conversation began to appear. Not when will things recover, not what do we build next, but something more fundamental. What does it mean to belong to a chain when the world grows dark around it? These conversations were slow, thoughtful, filled with an honesty that rarely appears in times of excitement. People spoke about what Solana meant to them, not as a technology, but as a place they had learned from, a place where they had grown, a place where they had met people who shaped their lives in ways the blockchain could never record. And slowly, the emotional center of the storm shifted. It was no longer about loss. It was about meaning. Meaning that survived. Meaning that held. Meaning that remained visible, even in the dimmest light. Somewhere in this long, reflective quiet, a realization spread gently through the community. Solana had not disappeared. Its identity had not dissolved. Its foundation had not cracked. The storm had revealed something deeper, a resilience quiet enough to be overlooked, soft enough to be underestimated, persistent enough to survive the darkest season a young civilization could face. And then, after many weeks of stillness, something subtle began to shift. A small project announced that it would continue building. A validator posted a message saying their node had never been stronger. An artist shared a new piece of work in colors brighter than the weeks before. It wasn't momentum. Not yet. It was more like the first faint warmth returning to the air after a long winter night. Not enough to change the weather, just enough to let the city remember that seasons do not last forever. That storms, no matter how deep, carry their own endings. That light, even when hidden, waits patiently for its moment to return. In these small signals, the community felt something they had not felt in months. The beginning of upward breath. Not hope in the loud sense, not optimism with fireworks, but a quieter kind of hope. The kind that grows in the spaces where resilience has been quietly practicing all along. A few builders began reopening their plans. Some teams revived paused features. People started speaking not about the storm, but about what life might look like after it. Not with urgency, not with expectation, just with the soft curiosity that belongs to a civilization that has survived what it once feared it could not. And as these conversations took shape, the storm finally began to loosen its hold. Not because it vanished, storms never vanish overnight, but because the people who lived through it learned to walk again while the sky was still gray. Learned to speak again while their voices were still quiet. Learned to build again without needing the world to applaud. The chain, steady as ever, carried them forward. Slot by slot, block by block, the rhythm of a civilization quietly preparing for its next season. A season that would not resemble the dawn, a season that would not erase the storm, a season built from what remained after everything else had fallen away. And in this slow, gentle transition, in this moment where exhaustion met determination, where sorrow met possibility, the first outlines of renewal began to appear. Soft first, like the first pale streaks.
A season that would not resemble the dawn. A season that would not erase the storm. A season built from what remained after everything else had fallen away. And in this slow, gentle transition, in this moment where exhaustion met determination, where sorrow met possibility, the early outlines of renewal began to appear. Soft at first, like the first pale streaks of morning touching a sky that had been dark for too long. Soon, the city of sunlight would learn how to shine again. But not yet. For now it simply breathed, slowly, quietly, together. And that breath, shared across thousands of people, thousands of nodes, thousands of quiet rooms, was the first true sign that the tide was beginning to turn. That the storm, for all its weight, had not broken the city. It had shaped it. And the shape it left behind was strong enough, soft enough, human enough to carry Solana into its next story, the story of return. A return not of hype, nor of frenzy, but of life. The soft resurgence that begins when a civilization
remembers itself.
The first signs of renewal rarely look like renewal. They arrive quietly. A small message in a silent channel. A commit pushed at 2 in the morning. A validator upgrading hardware, not out of urgency, but out of faith. In the weeks after the storm, Solana moved through a kind of twilight. Not darkness, not dawn, just that gentle in-between, where colors are muted and the world feels suspended. The chain kept breathing, steady and soft, as though it understood that the people around it needed time to gather themselves. And slowly, almost timidly, new warmth began to appear. A developer posted a screenshot of a tool they had kept improving even through the storm. An artist shared a sketch capturing the City of Time motif that Solana had come to symbolize. A small group of users tested a prototype for no reward other than curiosity. These were not announcements. They were gestures. Small lights placed gently along a dim shoreline. And that is how revivals always begin. Not with declarations, but with lanterns. Across the ecosystem, people started talking again in a different tone than before. Not the bright excitement of early growth, not the nervous tension of the storm, but something more grounded. A tone shaped by reflection, by resilience, by an understanding that staying is its own kind of courage. Projects that had paused reopened their repositories with soft messages like, "We're continuing." Teams that had been silent returned with updates, not about markets, but about architecture, testing, documentation, actual craft. It felt like a city rebuilding its foundations before repairing its skyline. The mempools grew livelier again, not with frenzy, but with a gentle hum that resembled conversation. Validators exchanged logs, not because something was wrong, but because they felt ready to strengthen the network together. There was a sense, not spoken, but shared, that Solana was becoming something new. Not returning to what it was, but growing into what it could be after understanding its own fragility. Healing has a sound. On Solana, that sound was the rhythm of developers writing tests, validators proposing improvements, and community members having long, slow conversations about the kind of civilization they wished to build now. For the first time in many months, people began to imagine a future not defined by speed, but by steadiness. Not just a chain that moved fast, but a chain that could hold the weight of its own dreams. And then, in this quiet atmosphere of quiet rebuilding, something unexpected happened. Laughter returned. Someone made a light-hearted meme about block times. Someone else joked that even storms need TPS. People replied with warmth, with emojis, with small pockets of joy that felt brighter than they had any right to be. It wasn't noise, it was life. Memes, in their strange, tender way, became the first true signal that the city was awakening again. Not because they were silly, but because they were human. Expressions of a community feeling safe enough to smile again. And soon that small warmth spread. Tiny projects resurfaced with updates no one expected. Developers announced libraries that had quietly matured during the long winter weeks. A new wave of creators started exploring the chain not because of hype, but because it felt alive in a gentler, more honest way. The tide was turning. Not with a crash, not with a surge, but with a long, slow inhalation that made the whole ecosystem seem to breathe differently. Somewhere in this rising warmth, a feeling surfaced that had been absent since long before the storm. Possibility. Not the overwhelming possibility that once rushed through Solana's dawn, but a calmer, more grounded version. The kind that grows after a civilization has weathered its first long night. And as people felt it, they began to look outward again, to prototypes waiting to be tested, to abandoned experiments worthy of revival, to new architectures that could make the chain not just fast, but enduring. It was around this time that the engineers who had once shaped the dawn returned to their quiet rhythms. Not triumphant, not shaken, simply present. Listening to the chain, feeling its new pulse, understanding that resilience had now become part of its identity. They approached their work with a softer determination, the kind that comes from knowing exactly what has been lost and exactly what remains worth building. And what remained was a great deal. A community still here. A chain still breathing. A culture that had survived the one storm it had never expected to face. And in that survival, gentle, imperfect, but undeniably real, the first true seeds of revival took root. Soon the tide would fully return. Soon the city would glow again, but for now it simply warmed. Quietly, slowly, together.
The return of energy did not happen all at once. It arrived the way morning light returns after a long storm, first as a faint glow along the edges of things, then as a warmth that slowly lifts the weight from the air. In those early days of revival, Solana felt different, not brighter, not louder, but clearer, as though the storm had washed away a layer of noise no one realized was there. Developers who had once chased rapid growth began to build with a quieter intention. They spoke more about architecture, less about timelines, more about durability, less about momentum. It was as if the ecosystem had collectively rediscovered the gravity of its own graft. And with this shift, Solana's heartbeat changed. Blocks still flowed swiftly, but the feeling around them slowed down, deepened, settled. Builders no longer rushed to place 1,000 ships on the water. They strengthened their harbors instead. It was in this newly softened season that a small but meaningful pattern emerged. People stayed, not because it was easy, not because it was profitable, but because something in the chain's identity still resonated with them even after everything else had fallen away. Staying is underrated. It is quieter than excitement, quieter than optimism, quieter than hype. But it is the foundation upon which civilizations are rebuilt. And stay they did. Validators upgraded infrastructure with a patience shaped by experience. Founders rewrote sections of code that had long needed attention. Artists returned to their palettes, finding colors that felt more honest after months of gray. People who had gone silent began reappearing one by one, like lanterns relighting in windows across a quiet city. And then Almost unexpectedly, a new wave of creativity rippled through the ecosystem. It started with small experiments, a lightweight game here, a clever on-chain mechanic there, a new kind of contract that did something simple in a surprisingly beautiful way. These tiny experiments did not claim to change the world, but they changed the atmosphere. They reminded people of the joy of building something just because it felt alive. And that joy proved contagious. Soon, hackathons filled again, with prototypes that glowed with curiosity rather than ambition. Some sought to improve the network itself, new schedulers, new fee designs, new ways to visualize the flow of time across the chain. Others explored the cultural side of the Solana experience. Small social worlds, playful collectibles, tiny tokens infused with humor and shared humanity. Among these, the earliest sparks of what would become Solana's meme coin renaissance began to flicker. Not as speculation, not as frenzy, but as a kind of art. Symbols that captured mood, emotion, community, and the collective wish to feel light again. After months of heaviness, levity felt like sunlight. Simple icons, a dog with an oversized grin, a frog drawn with loose watercolor strokes, a cat leaning against an imaginary skyline, began traveling through the ecosystem like small, cheerful visitors. People shared them not to predict markets, but to share warmth. It was remarkable how something so light could carry so much meaning. Because memes, in their quiet way, are emotional mirrors. They reflect not just humor, but longing, for connection, for relief, for a sense of togetherness after a season defined by separation. And so these tiny tokens, born of laughter, carried by hope, shaped by collective imagination, became a cultural tide that swept gently across Solana's recovering shores. They did not erase the storm. Nothing could. But they softened its memory. They reminded people that civilizations are not held together only by architecture, or liquidity, or performance metrics. They are held together by the stories people tell when life feels uncertain, by the images they share when words fall short, by the feeling of standing in the same weather as thousands of strangers who suddenly feel less distant. And as this cultural tide rose, another form of renewal was quietly unfolding beneath the surface. The engineers, the same ones who had shaped the dawn and guided the chain through its adolescence, were working again with a clarity sharpened by the storm. They refined consensus pathways. They redesigned priority mechanics. They introduced new tooling that brought transparency to parts of the network that had once felt opaque. Each improvement, no matter how technical, carried emotional weight. People felt the chain becoming steadier beneath their feet. The old metaphors returned, the river flowing more smoothly, the city breathing more evenly, the harbor learning to guide even the heaviest ships. Week by week, the atmosphere brightened, not in a sudden flare, but in a long exhale that carried relief and quiet pride. By the time spring arrived, something subtle but unmistakable had changed in Solana's air. You could feel it in the cadence of conversations, in the color of new artwork, in the way developers spoke about plans for the future without needing to rush. The civilization that had once risen too fast
stumbled, and endured a storm that tested its foundations, was learning a new rhythm. Slower, steadier, deeper. The tide had returned, not as a crashing wave, but as a warm swell that lifted everything with it. And for the first time since the lights dimmed, the city built on time felt fully alive again. Not perfect, not finished, just alive in a way that mattered. Alive in a way that promised the next chapter would not resemble the past, but would grow from it with quiet confidence. And as this new season unfolded, one truth became clear. Solana did not survive the storm by holding on to its old identity. It survived by becoming something new. Something softer, something wiser, something capable of carrying not just speed, but meaning. And in the quiet warmth of this returning tide, the civilization of Solana began to rediscover its light.
As the new season unfolded, there was a moment, a subtle, nearly invisible moment, when Solana crossed an unseen threshold. It wasn't marked by a headline, or a chart, or an announcement. It was marked instead by the simple, steady truth that people were no longer looking backward. The storm was still part of memory, but it no longer defined the landscape. It no longer weighed on every conversation. It no longer cast a shadow over every plan. What rose in its place was a gentle forwardness, a quiet willingness to imagine again. Developers spoke about the future with a tone that felt lighter than it had in many months. Their ideas stretched a little farther. Their plans grew a little braver. The air around them warmed with possibility. The chain itself reflected this change. Metrics that once wavered now flowed with a smoother rhythm. Validators reported stability, not with surprise, but with calm expectation. New tools revealed a transparency and maturity that felt earned, not inherited. It is a rare thing for a civilization to feel older and younger at the same time. Older in its wisdom, younger in its imagination. And it was in this balanced space that Solana's culture fully bloomed again. Creators returned with artwork that shimmered in colors of renewal. Developers released experiments so playful and inventive that they felt like spring blossoms after a long gray winter. Communities formed not around promises, but around presence. Not around markets, but around meaning. Not around certainty, but around curiosity. Meme coins, once symbols of frenzy, became symbols of light-hearted resilience. Tiny digital creatures swam through timelines, bringing humor to a place that had learned how much humor matters. Each one carried a small reminder that joy is not the opposite of hardship. Joy is what helps civilizations heal from it. And beneath this renewed cultural tide, the engineers continued their quiet work. Upgrades rolled out with a confidence shaped by storms survived.
Architectures strengthened, bottlenecks softened. New pathways opened for applications the early dawn had only dreamed of. Every improvement felt like a stone placed carefully back into the foundation, one that would help the city weather whatever seasons might come next. By midsummer, a feeling settled across the ecosystem, a gentle sense of wholeness, not triumph, not celebration, wholeness, as though the civilization had completed a cycle it never meant to begin, and now stood quietly on the other side of it, changed in all the ways that truly mattered. And in this calm, in this fullness, something beautiful became clear. Solana had not returned to what it once was. It had arrived at what it was meant to become. A city tempered by storms, softened by community, strengthened by care. A chain with a deeper pulse, a steadier spine, a warmer heart. A place not only built for speed, but for staying. A place not only built for sunlight, but for the quiet hours before and after it. And as this realization settled into the minds of the people, a new tide rose, one not made of markets, but of confidence. Confidence that this civilization could grow again, could endure again, could shine again. Not because it was unbreakable, but because it had already broken once and found itself still standing, still breathing, still alive in the ways that matter most.
Tonight's journey has taken us across bright mornings, unsteady afternoons, and the long, quiet hours of a storm-touched night. We've watched a civilization built from time and imagination learn how to stand again after the world around it shifted without warning. And now, as the story settles, as the tide relaxes back into the sea, I want to leave you with something softer. A reminder that all systems, blockchains, cities, lives, move in rhythms. There are seasons of brightness when everything feels effortless, and seasons of weight when each step feels heavier than the one before. There are storms, unexpected, unwanted, inevitable, that reshape the landscape in ways we don't always understand until much later. And there are mornings that follow those storms, quiet at first, almost hesitant, but full of the promise of becoming something new. Solana's story is not a story of perfection. It is a story of persistence, of a chain that continued to breathe even when the world held its breath. And maybe that is why it feels so human. Because all of us, in our own ways, learn to move through storms. We learn to rebuild. We learn to soften. we learn to grow. Tonight, as you rest, I hope you can take a small piece of that softness with you. Let the last echoes of this story settle around you like a blanket. Let your breath slow to match the gentle cadence of a chain finding its rhythm again. Let the quiet remind you that nothing asks you to move quickly right now. You are allowed to drift, allowed to rest, allowed to simply be. And as your thoughts grow lighter, more spacious, more dreamlike, I hope you feel the same calm tide that returned to Solana. A tide that brings warmth and possibility, and the soft assurance that even after the longest storms, light finds its way back. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. Sleep well, and let the gentle cadence of a world built on time carry you into rest. Good night.